So for the first video on this channel, I thought I'd discuss a book that kind of brings together the three topics that name the channel: literature, theory, history. It's John Guillory's 1993 book Cultural Capital, which was really a kind of a major entry in the debate over the literary canon, the books that should be considered, the works of great literature to be studied and to be taught. Now, his title, Cultural Capital, is taken from Pierre Bourdieu, who was a French sociologist who used this concept of cultural capital to describe the way in which different classes or class fractions in society will own and use certain cultural symbols, manners, ways of speaking, tastes in all manner of the arts, literal tastes in the food they eat, as sort of badges to show their membership of that class or class fraction, and to kind of maintain their membership, their good standing within that world. And Bourdieu would see education as being a key part of reproducing this state of affairs. He saw the school system, universities, and the relevant qualifications that go with them as sort of ways of perpetuating these dynamics. And what John Guillory does is he takes these ideas and applies them to thinking about the literary canon, and specifically the Western literary canon. And his main thrust, his main approach, is to say that what matters most is not necessarily whether the works within the canon kind of express the ideology or the beliefs of the ruling class or ruling classes, but more the canon itself, how that was shaped by the institutions that formed it, specifically the school, the university. And his argument is that it doesn't really matter so much what the works within the canon are saying, whether they support the ruling ideology or a progressive ideology, so to speak, that would criticise the ideology of the ruling classes. His argument is more that the very fact of those works having been chosen and shaped by these institutions, which will inevitably provide cultural capital to particular classes, that's what counts the most. So he takes up the whole idea of Western culture. He lists the reading list for a course in Western culture at Stanford University, and it's things like Plato's Republic, it's things like Augustine's Confessions, or Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, work of political philosophy from the 17th century, and going up into the Victorian era as well. And he notes that really these works are very different in ideology and what they seek to teach. So, I mean, in a footnote, he gives a good example of how Thomas Hobbes basically said, well, Aristotle was just a load of rubbish, really. But obviously, both Aristotle's works and Thomas Hobbes will still be in this category of Western culture. So he's saying that really this list is more expressive of something that the current educational system, or that institution specifically, wants to do with these works, the kind of agenda it has in shaping this whole idea of one Western culture. It's more to do with that than necessarily what the works themselves might say, so to speak. And I think this opens up some very fascinating ideas. He goes more into how what we would think of as the literary canon in English, in the vernacular, was in many ways the product of the new middle classes in England, particularly in the 18th century, particularly in the dissenting academies. So the schools that were open to young men who weren't Anglican, because you had to be an Anglican to go to Oxford and Cambridge at the time. So these dissenting academies kind of almost had to form a new canon in the vernacular, because previously to that, the canon of works which the aristocracy had to get to grips with to show their membership, to show their good standing within their class, were very much rooted in the classics, in Latin, in Greek. So for the nonconformists who didn't want to be part of the Anglican Church, they almost had to form a new canon in English, or at least the very idea of that. And this goes hand in hand with the development of Standard English, as perhaps represented by Samuel Johnson's dictionary in the 1700s, which sought to establish a commonality, the proper way to speak, the proper way to write, which again establishes a kind of cultural capital. And then he would go on, Guillory goes on to say how Wordsworth kind of furthered this concept, and certainly by the time of Matthew Arnold, the Victorian literary critic in the 19th century, this idea of the English canon that any well-educated bourgeois person was supposed to know and know well was fairly well established, leading to the creation of literary studies of the English degree as we know it. But what happened, at least according to Guillory's narrative, is that from the middle of the last century, a new kind of bourgeois culture has arisen, one which he would define as technocratic, bureaucratic, and one that values more technical skills, more technical thinking, in place of the old bourgeois culture, which, while they were making their money from running factories and mills and so on, they had this culture of high art, of spiritual values that they would perhaps be able to escape into, or see themselves in heroic terms through that vehicle. And what Guillory suggests is that since the middle of the 20th century, that old bourgeois cultural capital has become devalued more and more. It's lost its purpose. It no longer functions as a way for the new bourgeois to recognise and affirm each other, and hence we have the crisis of the humanities that we witness now, with humanities programs being devalued, being defunded, and their future being very much in question. He would see the birth of what's been called theory, of literary theory, as sort of an attempt to make English studies technical, to establish a new canon of theorists, such as Jacques Derrida, the French theorist, Michel Foucault, and various other big names that I won't go into now. So in a very long chapter about Paul de Man, who took after Jacques Derrida very much, Guillory suggests that this new theoretical term was an attempt to create a whole body of very technical works, very hard to understand works. There was a whole other level of cultural capital that one could attain. One could get qualifications to show that they, were in on that realm. And yet, ultimately, insofar as I suppose the man on the street would see these things as playing with words, or the technocratic new bourgeois would see that as being a very limited use to their entrepreneurial activities, it's not proved to be any more long-lasting or to have probably any better future than the old bourgeois cultural capital. So Guillory ends, after a long discussion of what aesthetic value kind of is, by saying that his vision is not to try to somehow do away with all these dynamics. I think he quotes Bourdieu to the effect that there's no way out of the game of culture. We're stuck with it. That's just the way things are. But he does suggest that if literary works were made available to everyone, then perhaps a better, more democratic way of appreciating these things outside these structures could emerge. But of course, he is relatively vague about the details of that. So I find it fascinating. I think it's not an easy read. To be honest, I've never really made it through the chapter on Paul de Man, but I've reread other parts of it, and there's much food for thought there. It's an approach that Guillory doesn't justify theoretically. He sort of assumes this idea of cultural capital and runs with it, and that's fine. I think it can be illuminating to assume something like that and see what patterns emerge, and whether that can enrich our understanding. I think it's interesting to apply this kind of thinking to other areas of study, theology, for example, or church denominations. It seems to me that church denominations, or different factions within them, very often have notable class dynamics involved. That there's usually a class fraction that will be very much associated with Pentecostalism, for example, or conservative evangelicalism within the Anglican Church. And that's a fascinating thing to me, insofar as that then can tie in with the way that these different church groups will try and do theology, the methods they are willing to accept or not. And that's given me a lot of food for thought again. So the interesting thing, of course, is to consider Guillory's own position within all this, and I'm sure he has. Frederick Jameson, the Marxist critic, has noted about Bourdieu that there's always a question of Bourdieu's own place within these structures. How much does the critique of cultural capital itself become a piece of cultural capital for those in the know, those in the right institutions to wear as a badge? Where does that place Bourdieu in that scheme of things? Where does it place John Guillory? I think also questions are raised about the future of the humanities. Can they be part of the AI-driven world that Keir Starmer is projecting? What does it mean that I now, who am not part of any institution, I am making a video available about all these things on YouTube for some reason? What reason's that? What does it do for me? So it's something that opens up many more questions, and questions that are worth challenging ourselves with as we face this interesting time, as the whole idea of the Western values continues to be a live one, and we have to make difficult choices about what we wish to value and pursue in the future.